So Werewolf by Night is slated to appear in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and those are words that I never thought I'd say over the course of my life. Never in my life did I ever think that we would see Jack Russell in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, mostly because he hasn't been relevant in 20 years. So it's gonna be kind of weird to see what they end up doing with this character. Now, having said that, how do we know that Werewolf by Night is going to appear in the MCU? Okay, so it recently came out that Kevin Smith had a conversation with Jeff Loeb at a previous point in time. For those of you guys who don't know what that means, back before Kevin Feige ran everything under the umbrella of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and even Marvel Comics to a degree, that originally you had Kevin Feige in charge of the movies and Jeff Loeb in charge of the TV shows. And the idea here is that Kevin Smith wanted to launch a Howard the Duck TV show and use basically all these 1970s characters. These characters that basically belonged on the island of misfit toys, just didn't quite fit in anywhere, and there was just something a little off about them, you know what I mean? Just a little, I don't know if I'd watch a show with that character by themselves, that kind of a thing. But Jeff Loeb's response was, no, the movie division is gonna be using Werewolf by Night, and that's how we know. Now again, that recently just came out, like within the last couple days. So this is a huge revelation here. Now when the time comes that Werewolf by Night is actually given a full-fledged announcement, we'll do a full-on 25, 30-minute long video over at Comics Explained, breaking down the entire comic book history of the character, assuming we can make it that long, because honestly, Jack Russell doesn't have a whole lot of history. But what's the quick and dirty on Werewolf by Night? Who is this guy? So let's wind the clock back on Marvel Comics for a second and jump back to the 1970s. See, in the 1960s, because like Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and Captain America had returned, all that kind of stuff, Marvel could publish anything and it would basically sell. By the 1970s, that hype train had gone away. And so just because they published something didn't mean that it would sell. And so what they started doing was basically trend jacking, hopping on popular trends and then making characters based off those trends. So if you look at Luke Cage, he was based off the blaxploitation era, Black Hollywood essentially. Characters like Blackula, you guys ever heard of that guy? One of the best movies ever in the history of Hollywood. I love that movie. Blackula is amazing. But then you also had Shang-Chi and Iron Fist, who were based off the Kung Fu hype of the 1970s, and then they tried to tap into the horror genre. Didn't go as well as you'd hoped, but we did get Werewolf by Night. So remember the discussion that we had previously where we talked about how Marvel would release anthology books, Marvel Premiere, different things like that? Well, Marvel Spotlight was another example of that, right? And it's quite exactly what it sounds like, which is Marvel spotlighting a particular character or a group of characters. Werewolf by Night appeared in Marvel Spotlight #2 back in 1972 and was created by Jerry Conway. Now, the funny thing about this is we didn't really get an origin for Werewolf by Night until his solo series with issue number 15, written by Roy Thomas. And the funny thing is that you end up learning that he is actually the result of a family curse, that it all goes back to a guy by the name of Grigori, the great-great-great-grandfather of Werewolf by Night. And Grigori was a guy whose wife was killed by Dracula, so he stormed the castle of Dracula, drove a stake through his heart, then dumped his body and his coffin in the river. Then he freed a girl named Lydia. Lydia, it turns out, was actually working for Dracula, and she herself was a werewolf. Lydia bit Grigori, and that's how he ended up becoming a werewolf. Now, the funny thing about this was that Grigori already had kids, which meant there was no way for him to pass the curse of the werewolf onto his family through the bloodline. Instead, it was passed on through a family curse. But all this changed when it came to the father of Werewolf by Night, a guy by the name of Gregory. Now, the whole thing behind this is that Gregory got his hands on the Darkhold. You guys probably remember the Darkhold from WandaVision. That was the book that you saw towards the end of the series and the book that Wanda was reading at the end of the post-credit scene at the final episode. But the whole thing was that Gregory got his hands on the Darkhold, and in doing so, activated the curse of the werewolf within the family genealogy. And so realizing this had happened, he basically sent his wife and his 2 kids to America, where their names were basically changed. That instead of it being Jack Russoff as it was in Russia or Transylvania, instead it was Jack Russell. And so when Jack turned 18 years old, the curse basically fell upon him and he became Werewolf by Night, in the sense that he only turned into a werewolf at night during the full moon, which I feel like is kind of a redundant statement. When have you ever heard of a full moon in the daytime? But the important thing here is that following that point in time, Jack Russell had a few different stories here and there, but none of them were super interesting. One of the more interesting things that happened to him, though, is he actually became part of a team called the Midnight Suns. The Midnight Suns were awesome. It was basically like the horror side of Marvel Comics, with a little bit of Doctor Strange thrown in as a singular team. It was awesome. It was a great concept. And of course, we are supposed to be getting that in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so it would make sense that they would do that. If I'm being honest, kind of sidetrack here from Werewolf by Night, I think what they're gonna do is they're basically gonna create the Secret Defenders in Doctor Strange 2, and then go from the Secret Defenders into the Midnight Suns with like Blade, probably Johnny Blaze, or maybe Danny Ketch, or possibly even Robbie Reyes as the Ghost Rider. Robbie Reyes is the one who played the Ghost Rider in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but like some version of the Ghost Rider character, Werewolf Werewolf by Night and then somebody else who knows what they're gonna do. Probably Michael Morbius from the Spider-Man film. But regardless of the situation, like we're supposed to be getting that team, which I think is gonna be awesome. But for Werewolf by Night himself, the big question you have to ask here is how are they gonna handle him? Like it's one thing to say like, yes, the movie division is gonna use him, but it's another to ask the question, how's it all gonna unfold? Because this was a statement made by Jeff Loeb some years ago before everything fell under the purview of Feige, back when you had like the Netflix TV side and then you had the Marvel Cinematic Universe movie side. Now it's all one. So like everything is under the purview of Feige. So we don't know if it's gonna be one of these things where Werewolf by Night appears in a TV show, if he has like a cameo in the Blade movie, or if he gets his own movie unto himself. If I'm a betting man, I think it's too big of a risk to grab a character like Werewolf by Night and just throw him into a movie that costs $300 million to make. That's a huge gamble, especially when it comes to a character that's so incredibly obscure. But at this point, after everything that's happened in the MCU, just the name itself, right, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, could be enough to just send people flocking to the movie theaters to see that film, especially if the trailer looks cool. I'm not 100% sure that's the case, because if you look at Black Widow, for example, it kind of bombed in the movie theaters, but a lot of that's because people were watching it at home on Disney Plus, right? Hence like the big beef between movie theaters and Disney at the moment. But I don't know if that'll really be the case. If I'm a betting man here, only a couple things are gonna happen with the introduction of Werewolf by Night. Either he's gonna show up as a cameo in a TV show, or he's gonna get a TV show unto himself. Because unless the TV show is using, massive special effects that cost a fortune like they did in Loki or WandaVision, it's gonna be a hell of a lot cheaper than a $200-300 million film that may not do that well at all, right? It could entirely be a huge bust. I mean, granted, Iron Man was a painfully obscure character to anybody who didn't read comics, and look how well that movie did, right? So just because a character is obscure does not mean that it won't succeed. Same thing with Black Widow and even Hawkeye. Pretty much anybody that was part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe lineup in the beginning, with the exception of like Thor, the Incredible Hulk, and Captain America, right? Nobody really knew anything about anybody, any of the other characters that we saw. Maybe a passing understanding, but certainly not enough to know their origins or anything along those lines, right? And so I think that Werewolf by Night getting a TV show is the best bet here. Plus you can do a lot of exploration with the character, and I feel like that's gonna be the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, not just for Werewolf by Night, but for other characters as well, that you basically treat the TV line as a way to produce shows that can go far more in depth with like the origins of characters, how they became who they were, and then you just throw them into the movies and you just make a movie based off those individual characters, or like a big team up or something like that, right? Like if you look at the X-Men, for example, Magneto gets a TV series, that Wolverine gets a TV series, Professor X, whatever your main lineup is going to be, or the most prominent members of that lineup, and then when you get to the movie, it's recruiting time, and then you get the plot, the story, so on and so forth. The movie ends, and then that's basically it. I think that's the future of the MCU. If not for everybody, certainly for the more obscure characters. I think Loki got a TV show because he was just so damn popular, so they knew people would go and see it. But nonetheless, with somebody like Werewolf by Night, I think it makes a lot more sense to make a TV show for that character, let people kind of ease into the character, let the hype build itself if the story's good enough, if the show is good enough itself, and then in turn, throw him into the MCU. Like I said, the only alternative to that is to basically have him have a cameo in the Blade film. Maybe like Blade needs help facing off against these vampires. He knows that werewolves are the mortal enemies of vampires, and so he in turn basically grabs Werewolf by Night, grabs Jack Russell, and the two of them go and fight some vampires. It's kind of a team-up film to a degree, but only at the very end or at one point in the film. So you still get that kind of treatment about Eric Brooks and how he became who he was. But at the end of the day, having something like that, something that kind of eases people into the character, seems like a far more financially safe bet than just throwing out $300 million to make a movie about a character that nobody's ever heard of and that people might not care about, because the reactions on social media already are like, I don't even know who this guy is. Like, why? Like, weird. It's like, that's weird. That's kind of strange. People are confused. They see it a little bit odd. Now, that confusion can turn into interest, which could turn this into a billion-dollar movie. I have no idea if that would be the case or not. But regardless, it's one of these things where at the very least, seeing Werewolf by Night in the MCU just seems awesome. I love the idea because again, one of the things that we've seen just by virtue of Loki and WandaVision and all those things is that this era of the kind of baseline Marvel Cinematic Universe format, which is to say stripped down heroes like Iron Man, Captain America to a degree, the Incredible Hulk, Thor, and just kind of teaming up to fight against some threat threat in a basic plot, that's largely gone, right? Like the Earthbound heroes fighting against some Earthbound threat, that's basically it, right? There's really no more going back and doing that anymore, right? There's no more Iron Man fighting Obadiah Stane. There's no more Captain America fighting the Red Skull. That kind of stuff is done. That instead we're focusing on much bigger things now, right? Loki literally brought back the multiverse. It literally gave us the multiverse. Doctor Strange is going to be running throughout the multiverse doing what he can to keep it contained. Wanda is now a multiversal character, right? Like she's on the same power level she was during the events of House of M. The ability to just kind of transverse the multiverse and presumably control it on a whim, right? I mean, it's huge now, right? The landscape is massive. And so while we may see kind of a return to that familiarity, I don't think we're going to see it for a while. Instead, I think it's going to be a lot of just kind of out there zonky, crazy stuff. And I've been telling people that for a long time, that as a person who's been reading Marvel Comics for 25 years, one of the things that you learn is that when it comes to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they've not even scratched the tip of the iceberg. By all standards of measurement, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has taken its first steps onto this mountain. Even despite what you've seen in the last 10 years, like it's just taken its first steps onto this mountain. In terms of the villains that exist out there, the different heroes, just on the X-Men side, you've got thousands of mutants to work with, and that's just the X-Men, right? Like you could make movies just focus on the X-Men for 200 years, just tie in everything else, right? Like the Avengers, non-Avengers teams, Secret Defenders, Young Avengers, Avengers Academy, the Initiative program. There's all kinds of things that you can do, right? Project Wide Awake, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy how long they can make movies for. When the time comes that the Marvel Cinematic Universe ends, it will not be because they ran out of content. It'll be because people got tired of watching. That's basically what'll happen, right? Like they can make movies for 1,000 years, right? It's crazy how much content's there, especially when you take into account how long it takes to make a movie, right? Like release 4 movies a year. It takes a little while to do that. So nonetheless, kind of back on track here. We got severely off track here. I know my little tangents can be entertaining at times, but back on track here. Werewolf by Night is going to be a great addition to the Marvel Cinematic Universe if they do it correctly. And that's what it really all comes down to. If they do it right, if the story's written correctly. So at the end of the day, I'm excited. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Let me know if you're excited as well. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.